You are listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 29th of April, 2024 on Monocle Radio. Western banks can't stop earning money in Russia. A Spanish prime minister threatening to quit decides to stay. And would you drive a forklift as a second career? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests, Marta Lorimer and Charles Hecker, will be discussing the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the largest apartment manager in the United States about how to manage a global housing crisis. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Marta Lorimer, Fellow in European Politics at London School of Economics and author of Europe as Ideological Resource, and by Charles Hecker, Senior Partner at Control Risks, and author of the upcoming book Zero Sum on International Business in Russia. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Good evening.
I have foreshadowed book talk that we are now going to do. I will start with you, Marta, because you have a book already out. Tell us about it.
Yeah, my book came out just last month, and it is on how European integration helped far-right parties look better.
And how did it?
In so many ways. There are 4 ways. You're going to have to buy the book to find out.
4 different ways. It's a lot of different ways. It's all about integration.
It's an academic book, you know. I've had to really dig deep into the process.
Dig deep. Well, you're going to be telling us a bit later, probably, on this show when we talk about European politics, where that goes. And Charles, not to foreshadow our first topic too, but you are steeped in Russia at the moment, aren't you?
I am up to my eyeballs in Russia, although I've already submitted the manuscript for a book that's coming out in November of this year about the last 30 years of international business in Russia, which turns out to have been one of the greatest commercial experiments in the world. The market opened in 91 and everybody rushed in. The market closed in 2022 and everybody rushed out.
We will talk about that, but how did it feel to get the manuscript out of the way?
Pressing the send button was quite a relief. But what I realized is that pressing the send button and my having finished the manuscript really is only the beginning of the process. And now there's editing and re-editing, and I think re-editing again, and we'll see how that goes.
So you find out that people read the book.
Oh no! Wait, somebody's going
to. That's the final phase, but that's the happy phase.
Somebody other than my close relatives, right?
I think the happy phase is the moment between the moment when the book is published and the moment when people start reading it. Because the book is out, you feel the great moment of accomplishment, but no one has started criticizing you yet because they haven't read it.
I see. The flood of criticism starts after that. Well, we hope not too much of that happens. But we will start this show in Russia, where, contrary to the public's perception and Western politicians' promises, sanctions for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine have only gone so far. Western banks, in particular, continue to make healthy profits in Russia, and not only that, but they continue to pay taxes on those profits to the Russian government to the tune of 800 million euros in 2023. One bank in particular, Austria's Raiffeisenbank International, earned 1.2 billion euros in revenues and paid over half the total tax of European banks to the Russian government as a result. Charles, is there a charitable explanation for this, in that the banks, there is one in that, if I understand this correctly, the banks are actually at the moment barred from selling some of their stakes and businesses in Russia?
So the most generous way of looking at this is to lend these banks a certain dose of sympathy by understanding that at the moment it is incredibly difficult to get out of Russia. There is now a state committee that sets the terms and conditions for companies to exit Russia. And they are extremely difficult. Selling a business is hard. Getting your money out is really hard. The government forces you to take a 50% haircut. The government also asks you to contribute 10% of the transaction price to the state coffers. And so even by leaving Russia, you're funding the war. The problem with this figure of 800 million euros in taxes just from the banking sector going to the Russian government is going to come as a fairly large black eye to the UK, the US, the EU, and the rest of the G7, who have made Russia more sanctioned now than any other country in the world, including North Korea. And sanctions were designed precisely to prevent this from happening. And with
clearly not, though.
Well, exactly. So what happened with the bank that you mentioned in particular, Raiffeisen Bank, an Austrian bank that has been in Russia since the country opened for business and has a very robust appetite for risk. Raiffeisen Bank essentially has the rest of the Russian banking market now to itself. Most of its Western competition has left. The market is smaller for banking in Russia, to be sure. But whatever's out there is basically Raiffeisen banks to have. And just a few weeks ago, the Financial Times caught Raiffeisen Bank essentially with its trousers down because they were advertising that they were hiring because of their ambitious growth plans in Russia. And so this is really running counter to the way the European Union wanted to see Raiffeisen Bank behave in Russia.
Marta, this is obviously running counter to what European leaders would like to see. I mean, how much in your mind of this falls on them? They did not want this to happen. How bad does this look that they are unable to stop it?
Well, it doesn't look great because, again, the EU has invested so much of its political capital onto sanctioning Russia. And it's just looking like they haven't really thought this through. And even if they had thought it through, that they're not really able to actually do anything to ensure that their banks behave in a way that is consistent with the sanctions that they have brought forward.
What, Charles, do you imagine, is there something more they can do when Marta says that at this point? Have the governments also been caught with their pants down here in that there were just versions of this that they did not foresee, actions that Putin took, kind of forcing also, I understand, banks to kind of sales to be signed by him, all of these steps that Russia is taking to keep banks there. Is there really nothing that European governments can do to stop it?
It is very, very frustrating to see the world's largest and most sophisticated regulators and markets and governments and political figures essentially learning as they go with sanctions. And it's disappointing because this isn't the first time or the only time that sanctions have been used in economic or in non-military diplomacy. And to really see this kind of making it up as we go along approach is backfiring. Sanctions are making life more difficult for Russia. The economy will at some point begin to genuinely start to creak and have bits and pieces fall off of it. But what the sanctioning governments have to do now is continually tighten enforcement of the sanctions, the type of sanctions, the scope of sanctions. But what you wind up with up until now and quite likely for the future is a game of whack-a-mole.
And Marta, I wonder if you feel like the pressure is still there for European governments to do what Charles is talking about. What's the public perception, do you imagine, at this point? We're also, over 2 years into this war. There are other aspects of this that we've talked about a lot on this show, military aid, all those things where kind of the interest is maybe waning. Do you imagine there is a pressure on European governments from their publics to correct this?
That's part of the problem. There is just a major poll released today in France in preparation for the EU election where they were testing what issues do French voters specifically care about. Now, you'll know that Macron has just given this really big speech on Europe, on how Europe needs to get strategic autonomy and everything. And I believe that about 13% of French voters identified Ukraine as a priority.
And why is that in your mind? Why has it dropped off so much, given the stakes here that politicians talk about still pretty much all the time?
Because voters don't really seem to think that it's no longer in its acute phase, where it was very clear that it was having some very intense and real economic repercussions on several European countries. Now it seems like we've passed that acute phase, so we can move on to other things. Well, it's clear that that might be the case perhaps in some European countries, but it's not the case in Ukraine.
Charles, I did want to just jump on one other thing before we move on to another topic on here, and that's just when you mentioned sanctions, we've been at this for a long time. It's not the first country to be sanctioned. Therefore, are there any lessons in the other direction? Are there lessons that, governments might apply to other countries China, for example, even if we don't, pull out of a place like China now, are there ways to be ready for this kind of thing when we have to be next time?
So I think there are two lessons to bear in mind here, and that is that what I think Western governments probably knew in advance but may not have anticipated fully enough was the extent to which Russia and also Western companies were able to make workarounds and were able to transfer funds, transfer goods, and essentially evade sanctions through fairly complicated financial and trade mechanisms that got banned goods into Russia via third countries. And so I think that shutting that down is difficult, but I think that we should anticipate that more in the future. The other thing about sanctions that you need to anticipate is that sanctions also damage the sanctioning countries. And particularly when you start to talk about an economy as large as China's, the more we try to clamp down on China's economy, the more it bounces back on the rest of the world economy. And so there's always, for better or worse, a balance to be struck.
Well, let's move a little westwards now. The European Parliament's elections don't typically attract the highest of turnouts, but recent elections have seen a number of gimmicks put in place to try and raise their profile, including making it personal, having each party name top candidates who could potentially take on a post, such as President of the European Commission. And tonight we'll see those top candidates, including current President Ursula von der Leyen, hold a televised debate. Also this week, in a bid to raise the profile of Italy's Brothers of Italy party, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni announced that she would be running in June's elections. This despite promising not to spend a single minute of her time as Prime Minister to campaign and pledging to reject the actual seat in Strasbourg if her party wins. Marta, let's just start very simply here. Are we excited by these elections? Give us your best pitch for why we should all be tuning in tonight.
Stoked. No, I think we should be excited about the elections. The European elections are actually really important in terms of determining the composition of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a co-legislator in the European Union, so it actually does matter who gets a seat there. It's also going to be a very important election for the European Union because we know that parties that are openly Eurosceptic, particularly parties of the far right, are going to do extremely well. So it is an election that is going to be important in terms of where the European Union goes next. Now, whether the debate today is going to be important is an entirely different matter. The interesting thing with this debate is that in 2014, the European Union kind of introduced this Spitzenkandidaten procedure. So this idea that political groups in the European Parliament would say that if they won, their candidate would become the head of the Commission. In 2014, this actually worked. So the candidate of the EPP was then selected and became the head of the European Commission. The days of
Jean-Claude Juncker.
The good old days of Jean-Claude.
Who was quite a colourful candidate as well.
He was a wonderful character, the JCJ. But what happened in 2019 is that Manfred Weber, who was the candidate of the EPP, did not then get to lead the Commission because the leaders of the EU in the European Council decided that they wanted someone else. And that's how von der Leyen got her position. So I actually find it quite ironic that von der Leyen is now competing in a process that in the past actually worked against her, would have worked against her. And there's already a lot of speculation that, in fact, she might not be the candidate that most heads of states would want in the Commission. So I don't really know that this debate is going to change anything. But yeah, the European elections, those are actually really interesting.
Charles, what is your sense of these European elections, also sort of as an outside watcher? I mean, to that point of sort of Ursula von der Leyen and who's going to lead Europe, this has always been the problem with Europe, that you don't know who's going to be in charge necessarily based on an election. You don't know which group to pay attention to anyway, whether it's the European Parliament or the Council of the EU or others or national party heads. So what is your perception of how much this matters for also outside of Europe?
Well, that's precisely the point. So here we are, having left the European Union, sitting in the UK, and even when we were in the European Union, the UK really never paid all that much attention to the European Union, the European elections, and witnessed by the fact that Nigel Farage was a candidate and a successful candidate and a member of the European Parliament, having never won after 7, I think it was, attempts, having never won a seat in the UK Parliament. He was actually sort of ushered into the European Parliament and caused a bit of a stink there before they all turned their backs, quite literally, and left in a huff. Of those of us with the North American accents in the studio, one of us has nailed it on European politics. I am sort of left guessing, although I have to sort of hand it to, albeit sort of slightly backhandedly, to Giorgia Meloni. Who obviously feels comfortable enough in her position in Italy to pull an electoral stunt like this. And my question to Marta in the green room, as we were waiting for the broadcast to begin, was, is this her attempt to sort of stuff the parliament with her party by leading and being their sort of flag bearer into the elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think Meloni has several things going on for her here. One of them, I mean, the big thing that she has done yesterday is saying, yes, I'm going to be running. I'm going to be the head of all lists with my party in the European Parliament. And please vote Giorgia. She actually asked voters to just refer to her by her first name because she likes the idea of being a very...
Well, I believe we also have Ursula 2024.
Yes, we do. But I think that has a different. I think in Italy, just Giorgia is such a big thing. She wrote her book was called Io sono Giorgia, and it's got a whole lure behind it. But yes, she's really trying to make these elections about herself, and she doesn't necessarily care about stuffing the parliament with her people. What really matters to her, well, first is to get a good delegation so that she would become the de facto leader of the European Conservative and Reformist group. So that's important to her. But the other thing that is really important to her is to use this basically as a popularity contest as home, and just say, look how incredibly popular I am. I got a really stunning result in the European election, which incidentally is going to have a lot of effects in terms of her coalition partners, and particularly for Salvini, who is not dealing with this well at all.
Just to follow up on that, though, Marta, there is a danger in that, of course, because especially in these European elections, this is why turnout matters, right? As Charles was saying, Nigel Farage getting in the past, the far right often does pretty well in European elections, even better than they maybe do in the national elections. So how important for that reason, too, is it maybe to get people who are popular like Meloni or Ursula von der Leyen, personalities that do actually bring people to the polls?
Yeah, there's something to be said about personalization of politics potentially bringing more people to the polls, but a big question is, why is it that you're bringing them? And this is the curse of European elections. European elections are notoriously second-order elections. People don't really care about them. Less people turn up. They're not really fought on European issues. And they're usually treated as beauty contest for national politicians. And I think that this is the risk with Meloni making this election that is about her. She's not really engaging with any meaningful European issue that we might want to be discussing. But she's just saying, I'm popular at home. Make me popular in Europe.
Charles, just a final word on this. I wonder if Ukraine has impacted Europeanness in any way in your mind. The stakes, as we were talking about in the first issue, are raised here. There are countries quite literally dying for the chance to be a part of this.
That's right. So I agree with what Marta said about how Ukraine has sort of slipped down the European agenda. And is now sort of replaced by lots of other business of the day, including what's happening in Gaza and, energy and the green agenda and the upcoming elections and Mr. Macron and his sort of boxing workouts. But I think that Ukraine did something to Europe that if it hadn't happened now, it would have happened or might have happened some other time. And that is alert the European Union and the rest of Europe to its own strategic requirements. And that is that there is a ground war in Europe on the border with the European Union The countries that border Ukraine have been amazing in the way they absorbed refugees. And with the exception of Hungary and Slovakia, the EU has largely sort of coalesced and solidified around Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But what they need to do now is this strategic independence that Marta was referring at the very beginning. This is particularly acute this year because if Donald Trump wins the presidential elections in November of this year, I think it's probably safe to assume that Europe's going to be cut free and on its own. And if it doesn't have a strategic view of its role in Europe and the world, it's going to have to get one very quickly.
Well, sticking with Europe, we're going to hone in on Spain next, where the country's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, today said he would stay in office. Now, that's not normally an announcement that's going to attract a lot of international headlines. But given that just last week Sanchez had suggested he might step down, thanks to arguably politically motivated investigations of his family, his decision today was closely watched. Marta, it's never maybe a good look to consider resigning and then stay, but given these unusual circumstances, what did you make of today?
I think it was very interesting the way in which Sanchez played this. It's arguably an interesting move. I think he realized that probably no one really wants an election in Spain right now. They've had one very recently, and that was an early election already. But I think the reasons he decided to stay had a lot to do with his own popularity, right? He said that one of the reasons he decided to stay was that there was a show of solidarity from others. And I suppose that in an electoral context, again, Spain is going to be participating in the European elections next month. That is something that might actually be able to give him a lot of strength. So I think the other thing, of course, is that you have an election in about 1 month and a half. The last thing you want is to not have a government when the top positions in the European Union get assigned.
Charles, that's sort of Marta's outlining the political aspects of this, but I can't help in this kind of story to wonder if we sometimes also forget that politicians are human to some degree. He was reflecting for 5 days. If we want to take him at his word, he was quite struck by his family, his wife being targeted and being investigated at the moment. Partisanship is getting very personal these days, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, I think there are a few things to unpick in all of this. And the first one is just how spurious the allegations against his wife appear to be. They've already been discredited to a certain degree. It was a big shock that the court system actually picked up the complaint that came from a campaigning unit with obvious political biases and according to, the reporting on all of this, very little regard for transparency and the truth, even though it's called Operation Clean Hands. And so there was a bit of theatricality in the charges that were leveled against him. And then I think his response also had a certain amount of theatricality to it as well. I can't help but think that there was a bit of, show me how much you love me in the way Sanchez played this. And he's done this before. And that was, he said, look, to make a coalition here, I'm going to cast my lot with the Catalan separatists. Show me that show me if you love me. And then when his party was clobbered in local and regional elections, he called that snap election. Again, sort of come out and support me. And now he sort of, goes, takes to his bedroom and, and declares that he pulls a Greta Garbo. And then kind of comes back again and says, see, I knew you would love me. And I think that there's a little bit of this going on in his relationship with the voters.
So when it comes to that kind of game that he's playing, Marta, I wonder if you think it is going to work. As also an expert on the far right, what is the far right going to make of this? Has he kind of caught them at their own game?
I don't think you can ever catch the far right at its own game. I think the problem with these things is that it reminded me of the line that by the time a lie can circle around the world twice, but the truth is still putting on its shoes. And I think that that's kind of where the far right plays with this, that it doesn't even matter if any of this is true. By the time it has been proven to be wrong, so much time will have passed, and this will have become a lie that has established itself so much in their minds that they can still reap a political benefit from it. So in that sense, sure, there might be an element of this that works in Sanchez's favor, where he can say, okay, look, I knew you loved me, I'm back. But at the same time, it doesn't really harm the far right in any meaningful way.
Charles, I do have to ask, because the right will no doubt compare this with things like Donald Trump and say that, we're always being targeted, but when it is a left candidate, oh, well, then, of course, it's a politically motivated prosecution. How do we explain that, the difference to voters and to people who are maybe not always up on the details of whether something is spurious or not?
So I'm going to sort of retreat to a sort of a common place here in a comfort zone, that is that facts matter. And, one of the things that the right wing did, at least in the United States, particularly in the very early days of the Trump administration, is it introduced this concept and this notion of alternate facts. And even with things as elementary as the turnout to President Trump's inauguration, which was pretty sparse when you looked at the mall in front of the Capitol in Washington, and they compared it to Obama's turnout, which was absolutely riotous. And I think that the way you fight the sort of the rhetoric, the cheating, the dirty tactics, the fake news, this whole idea of lies getting around the globe twice while the truth is putting its shoes on, is that you have absolutely got to insist on standards of fact and a commonly accepted concept of the truth. That may sound a bit idealistic, but anyway, here we go. And
this is so pre-2016.
I'm getting old. This is so. And then
it's hopeful, though. We like this. There's a bit of hope here.
I mean, lastly on this, and that is that it is really to as a last-ditch effort to appeal to the public's sense of dignity and common sense.
Well, let's move on for now, because we're never going to solve this in 1/2 hour. Let's move on to the job market, because when it comes to career changes later in life, you could do worse than reliving some version of youth and driving a forklift. Or that's apparently what South Koreans in their 50s have convinced themselves of. A record number of South Koreans took exams last year to acquire government-certified qualifications, making them fit for a second career, with forklift drivers the most popular choice. Marta, what struck me on this part of what struck me, forklift certifications claimed the top spot over cooking Korean food the last time around. Do we agree with that? It's impressively practical as the most in demand.
Yeah, well, practical jobs never run out of fashion, do they? I was quite surprised as well, because I've always thought that if academia didn't work out for me, my second job would be as a baker. So this is...
There we go. You agreed with the 2022 choice, not the 2023.
Exactly. Again, very 2022 of me. I'm a vintage at heart. But yeah, it's quite an interesting choice. But I wonder if there's also a gendered dimension to that.
Well, I was going to ask you, Charles, to go. Are we going to just lean straight into the gendered stereotypes here? And did you have a toy forklift or another truck when you were growing up? And would you love to take a job doing the real thing?
I had a sort of, not a forklift, but I had like a sort of construction crane, like one of these things that reaches way high up to build skyscrapers kind of thing when I was a kid. So
I think that counts.
That was yeah. Pretty gendered in the building trades. I think there's a serious note and a slightly whimsical note in all this. Starting with the whimsical note, I would gladly take her job as a forklift operator. I know that they're dangerous and you need to be careful, but done properly, it looks like something that could be kind of interesting and a little bit of fun. The more serious thing here, though, is what this means about job discrimination against people who are over a certain age, and how hard it is for people to either change jobs or re-enter the job market or stay in the job market. And I think I have read articles in the very recent past. Sorry, I'm not predicting the future just yet.
I have 2016 to 2030
and beyond. I have read some recent pieces that this is a particularly acute problem in Japan, where executives are deemed to sort of be past their prime at a certain age, and they are sort of routinely turfed out, but they feel that they've still got, and forgive me for this, gas in the tank, and they need to do something with it. And so here is the South Korean population saying, let's go drive forklift trucks.
There is a serious point to this, as Charles outlined, but Marta, there's also perhaps, to end on a bit of a positive note, what is wrong with following your passions in a second career? Is there something in that regard that you would love to do if money, sadly, was no object?
Oh, I have so many options. I've actually got a list of alternative jobs that I would enjoy if I didn't have to earn money for a living.
Give us the top three.
The top three is, academia, then bakery, and then circus.
Amazing.
I think I'm a keen circus performer. I'm not very good at it, but I find it's a wonderful form of exercise. So I think those are my top three alternative career choices.
We're going to have to check if there's a government certification for circus performer that you can maybe work your way into.
There's a National Academy for Circus Arts, so there actually is.
Charles, anything to top that? What would your passion be?
I have to tell you that at one point when I was in charge of these sorts of very important things, I chose a circus training venue as the site for my office's Christmas party. And
which one?
Never lived it down. There is a circus training venue in Shoreditch that is just a wonderful place to go and have some fun. It didn't go over very well with my colleagues. So I'm going to stay away from the circus. I think if I had my druthers, I think my number one alternative career would be as a sushi chef.
A sushi chef, that's an interesting one. I have to say one for me, or just more a friend's father that I was quite touched by, was an oil man and then became a postman after his career in the oil business because he just loved talking to people and bringing the mail around.
That's a great second choice.
I thought
career.
I could do that. I could do that in my retirement. That would be a way to stay active as well.
And I think, we've accepted that linear career trajectories are no longer a thing. We all have to be open to changing. So it's good to have a forklift plan ready.
On that happy note, Marta Lorimer and Charles Hecker, thank you very much for joining us. And finally, on today's Daily, we turn to the world of real estate. Greystar is a global company, specializes in the development and management of residential assets, and as the largest apartment manager in the United States, it is a firm that knows a thing or two about addressing the challenges posed by the housing crisis worldwide. Mark Kuijpers is the head of Greystar for the Netherlands, Germany and Austria, and earlier he spoke with Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, to find out more about Greystar's role in being part of the solutions in his patch of the world.
The problem, especially in the Netherlands, is the undersupply of new homes coming to the market. And let's say if you go one level more granular, then the supply that is there is either for sale housing or social housing, which means that quite a large part of the population that is actually looking for a home is left out. And that is especially the younger generation with middle income, which income is too low to afford buying a house, but it's too high to be eligible for a social home. And they are essentially left out in the current market. And that is actually a target group that we really focus on with our development and investment capabilities to really build product at scale in that mid-rent segment, but also really targeted to 1- and 2-person households, because that is exactly what this target group is about. They're not yet families, they're not students. It's those households that, let's say, have 5 to 6 years of working experience, wanting to live in the cities, not yet wanting to vest themselves for a very long time and seeking for the flexibility of renting, but also seeking for an environment in which they find people that think alike. They want flexibility in terms of the use of their home, so it's not only about the place to live, eat and sleep, it's also the place where you work, because ever since COVID we've seen a vast increase in working from home. So to provide the facilities that you can work from home in a very professional way, but also to have your leisure moments, to sport at home, etc. And that is really the kind of product that we're providing to try and solve and help solve the housing crisis.
It's really interesting when you mentioned there, the type of household that you're targeting there, because one of the issues that we see across the sector is that the vast majority is still building for that idea of the family household, the average of a couple with 2.5 children. The reality is that is no longer the vast majority of households entering the market. Do you feel like there's a need then to kind of adapt to new types of families that we're seeing, to the new types of households that are emerging and having that buying power and that desire for, their own independence and space?
Absolutely. So if you would look at the Netherlands and look at the demography versus the housing stock that is currently there, it's actually a complete mismatch, in terms that a lot of people want to live in the cities and prefer living in an apartment, and that is younger people, but also elderly people that want to live on a leveled floor. But elderly people typically are still stuck in their family homes, whereas young families would want to have a family home, but they cannot find one. So the sort of reaction from the market, but also from the municipalities, is to provide new family homes, to help families find a place to live. But what you should actually do is build more apartments for elderly people, but also for younger people, and free up the family homes by, let's say, moving elderly people from their family home into the cities, into apartments, and then freeing up those family homes for the young families that are looking for it. So that is an interesting dynamic that we see there. And indeed, if you look at household composition but also household formation, the trend is really towards more 1 and 2 person households that are not yet wanting to start a family. They sort of only start families at the age of 35 or even slightly above. So especially the target group, let's say between 25 and 35 or maybe even 40, that is a target group that wants to live in the cities, that don't really want a very big house, but want to live close to services, amenities, public transport. So that's a vast group of people that is underserved simply at current.
And tell me, are there any particular projects you've been working relating to this at Greystar that you'd like to highlight for us, and perhaps some benchmarks for the solutions that you've just been describing?
Well, I think one of our key examples in the Netherlands is the main portfolio that we created over the past 6 years, with one sort of flagship asset in Amsterdam Southeast. It's called Our Domain Amsterdam Southeast, sitting right opposite of the academic hospital, which is one of the largest academic hospitals actually in the Netherlands, sitting right on top of a public transportation hub, which brings you in 15 minutes to the city center of Amsterdam, but also like 20 minutes to the city center of Utrecht. And what we created there is 1,500 units in total, over 3 building blocks with a sort of central park lying in between, connecting the buildings. One of those blocks is specifically targeted at students and young professionals with at around 900 units. And the other 2 blocks with a total of at around 600 units are more towards young professionals and small families. And if you look at the demand that we have for that product, it's amazing. So we have 1,500 units, it's 100% leased, but we still have a waiting list of almost 10,000 people that want to live with us in that asset. And that, I think, shows how this product appeals to that specific target group.
Now, we're here at MIPIM, nearly at the end of what's been an incredibly busy week. Tomorrow the festival wraps up. Are you optimist about the future of the sector and the industry, and perhaps what are some of the key trends you've been seeing and talking about while you've been here on the ground in Cannes?
I am optimistic. Obviously, we are in a bit of a difficult moment now with interest rates that came up quite a bit, with municipalities and central governments here and there putting regulations in place that do not really help to support new investment. Although we see interest rates come down a bit, we also see that the politicians are starting to understand that they should be careful with regulations because they would hinder new investments. So I think that is now starting to come together. And we're pretty positive about new investments in the Netherlands, especially if you are able to really approach them from a development angle, and we are able to create the kind of product that we really want to operate, so we can add value. And we can share a bit of that value with the landowner or with the developer that is developing it. You can make things work again. So that is what we're doing on a daily basis, and we got quite a strong pipeline of new developments coming through in the next 6 months or so. So that's I'm positive.
Mark Kuijpers of Greystar speaking to Andrew Tuck there. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists today, Marta Lorimer and Charles Hecker. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.